One of the archaeological methodologies that we use is classical archaeological method and theory in determining Noah's Ark, and thousands of books have been written about this type of method and theory. But essentially, you could boil it down by saying archaeologists compare a historic account to an archaeological site to see how the traits at the archaeological site correlate with the account. And here, with the Ararat Archaeological Site in the southern gorge of Greater Mount Ararat, correlates 100% with the different accounts of Noah's Ark in the Old Testament, by Jesus Christ in the New Testament, by Berossus, the Babylonian scholar, and Josephus, the Jewish Roman historian, and also Noah's boat, as it's described in the Qur'an, matches 100%. Let me describe this. In Genesis 6-9, the ark is mentioned with several traits. One is that it is built of gopher wood, which in Hebrew is gopher, which relates to parasin in Greek, and where we get cupressus, which is the name of the genus for cypress. The Ararat Archaeological Site is primarily built of cypress. The planks on the exterior are not only aged, but also were subject to tremendous stress. And there is a lot of evidence throughout the ark for cypress canker. It's very evident throughout the ark. But one of the things that is very interesting is that as cypress ages and is subject to stress, it exudes a lot of sap that smells very good, but also provides an additional sealant on the wood. The other woods that are present are oak, and in a minority of instances, we're going to talk about this, is teak. So that's one of the traits that is in the Ararat Archaeological Site. Now, on the interior, the beams and a lot of the cypress wood is crafted as softwood, cut down and taken right into the ark and then shaped by stone adzes. And you can see Noah and his family were making flat boards and flat planks. And you can see this on the interior of the site. Another trait that is mentioned in Genesis 6-9 is pitch. God tells Noah to cover the exterior and the interior with pitch, sealant. So I've already described the cypress sealant or the resin material, but also Noah covered the interior and exterior, and in many instances the artifacts are covered with a bitumen sealant, which is a petroleum-based sealant that's very evident in the Levant. Another trait that's very evident is the dimensions, 300 by 50 cubits by 30 cubits in length, width, and height. The Ararat Archaeological Site measures 158 meters, but the proportions all match the description of the ark by the 300 by 50 by 30 cubits. The proportions are wonderfully correlative. But what's interesting about this is we're talking about a longer cubit. Very conservative Islamic scholars and Jewish scholars posited that the cubit was longer than the 18 inches that many Westerners surmised was the length of the cubit. So we're dealing with a longer cubit, especially in Iran and in northern Iraq. They talk about the cubit for fabrics. And this is wonderfully correlative with the length of the cubit that we find in the Ararat Archaeological Site. Another trait that was mentioned was for Noah to bring in foodstuffs for the animals to eat. And you see this throughout the Ararat Archaeological Site. So far, 2 huge storage areas have been found in Locus 8 and Locus 3 that are filled with principally 3 seeds. Seeds of cicer or chickpea, pisum, which is pea, and vicia or velia, which is bitter vetch. Bitter vetch is not common today, but it was widely part of the Neolithic diet. But this site antedates or comes before the Neolithic and dates to 13,100 to 9600 BC, or the Late Epipaleolithic Period. Another trait that we see at the Ararat Archaeological Site is thousands of cages. Now, these cages range from 20 centimeters to up to 4 meters in length. Many of them are rectangular. This is wonderfully correlative how Noah's Ark is described in all the different sources we're discussing. Another correlation is the amount of animal byproducts. Feces of every sort of animal fills the interior of the Ararat Archaeological Site. And not only animal feces, but also every type of animal byproduct, fur to exoskeletons, discarded skins of reptiles, scutes of larger reptiles, to feathers. A lot of the cages and on the ground you see just a huge array of different feathers. And this is wonderfully correlative of what Genesis and the Qur'an describe as Noah bringing in 2 of every animal, and then in Genesis, 7 of every clean animal and bird. Another mention that equates with the Ark is the Noah's Ark having 3 decks. And that's what you find at the Ararat Archaeological Site. 3 floors, a top, a middle, and a bottom deck. Now, in the Qur'an, it mentions that there are 2 decks. And what's interesting is that we were able to find in Locus 3 in sub-area B3. Noah cut through the upper deck to, I think, let some of the larger animals in. A lot of folks have mentioned that there's a discrepancy between Genesis that mentions 3 decks and the Qur'an that mentions 2 decks. Both are correct depending where you are in the Ark. Another correlation that you find is on the top deck there are apertures, 1 cubit in height and width, and you find this in sub-area B2 and Locus 2. So again, another correlation. Well, let's turn to the Qur'an. The Qur'an mentions very interesting traits that the Ark, or Noah's boat, came to rest on the highest mountain. Greater Mount Ararat is the highest mountain in all the Near East. It's an absolutely towering mountain. Another thing that is mentioned in the Qur'an is that the waves that Noah's boat confronted were as high as mountains. And what's interesting is you find ballast features along the right and left side, or the starboard and port side, ballast features comprising rows of rough-cut cypress logs holding back a linear stretch of small, medium, and large-size boulders. And these are between the exterior hull of the vessel and the outer shell, right on the third deck, stretching most of the length of the Ararat Archaeological Site. Another trait that is mentioned in the Qur'an is Noah is told to descend with peace. And this is what is found at the Ararat Archaeological Site, where the site is at the top of the southern gorge, which is filled with sand-like glacial scree. And I've fallen in it several times, and it's very palatable. It's like falling on a soft sand dune, where Noah and his family and the animals could descend with relative comfort. Another trait that is mentioned in the Qur'an is for Noah to worship, and this is also mentioned in Genesis, and we find a codex, a written document, that has very similar symbols to what you have in the caves in the Upper Paleolithic in Europe and North Africa. So you have this worship of a single deity that's seen in the codex and matches symbols that you find in cave sites in the Upper Paleolithic, the final part of the Stone Age. Now let's turn our attention to Berossus. Berossus was a Babylonian scholar, And one interesting thing he said is that around 300 BC, that Noah's Ark was 5 stadia in length and 2 stadia in width, which is a huge expanse, much larger than what's described in the Qur'an and in Genesis. But what we find is that currently the expanse of the site is in the southern gorge of Greater Mount Ararat, cover 5 stadias in length and 2 stadias in width. That's both the dimensions of the ark, or the spread of the features of the ark, on the left and the right side or east-west side of the gorge, and also the expanse of the archaeological features. Now, Josephus was a Roman and Jewish historian, and he mentions that the ark was braced with crossbeams. And you find so many crossbeams throughout the Ararat archaeological sites at different heights of the walls. So it's not only at the top of the walls, like many land-based structures, but also in the middle of the walls and at the floors. There's also a lot of evidence for coke and dowel and mortise and tenon joinery. And the interior of these joints are covered by pitch again, this bitumen sealant and the Cypress resin. So another wonderful correlation. Now, one of the last and very interesting correlations is that Alexander the Great mentioned that he and his forces visited the Ark, and that the Ark was located in the middle of a lake. And that's exactly what you find during the middle of the summer in June, July. Area A1, where the most pristine loci are found of the Ararat Archaeological Site, is literally in the middle of an expanse of water when the glacial ice melts, filling up this plateau. Now, later on, the waters dissipate, and archaeologists are able to enter in the tunnels that descend 4 to 11 meters into the interior of the Ararat Archaeological Site. So again, a wonderful correlation with what you have between 5 different sources of the Old Testament, the New Testament, the Qur'an, Berossus, and Josephus, and then the 6th one being the legends of Alexander, that fulfill 100% what you find at the Ararat Archaeological Site. And because of that, we can be assured from the archaeological method theory from classical archaeology that the Ararat Archaeological Site represents Noah's Ark. Thank you.